wonderful welcome to you all, friends and supporters. I'm just delighted to be invited to come and stand here. So I'm going to introduce Jonty, although he is going to talk about himself at length. Our very special guest, who is Director of Arts at the BBC and author, and going to be another book next year, we hope. Yes. So Jonty Claypole, welcome.
Good evening, and thank you very much to Jane and the Stuttering Foundation. It's a great honour to be here with you all tonight. I'm also incredibly impressed at your audiovisual tool. I work for the BBC, and every time we try and show a video at a presentation, it never works. So you're way ahead of us. The theme of the evening and this talk is about stuttering and creativity. And I'm writing a book at the moment about this, and in this talk I'm going to share, and it's the first time I'm sharing some of the thinking and work I've done so far. You're all terrifyingly, all of you I've spoken to are terrifyingly expert, so please come and give me feedback afterwards if I've got things wrong. Just before I start, just so you know who you're hearing from, I began stuttering as a child. I was very, very lucky to be treated at the Michael Palin Centre by Elaine, and not directly by Francis. But funny enough, earlier today, Elaine and I worked out that I think when I did it, I think we agreed to say it was 2006, not 1985, but anyway. I think it was the first year you were doing the integrated approach with parents, and so Elaine was working with my parents in that year, so that was a wonderful connection to make, and the work they do and the impact they had on me was just tremendous, so it's great to be here with them as well. I did continue to stutter through my adult life, and it had a lot of impact on the career decisions I made, and my number one love is the arts, and I built a career for myself behind the scenes of the arts in broadcasting. About 5 years ago, I became a lot more fluent, and for a number of reasons, I did some very good intensive therapy at an organisation called City Lit in London. But also, I fell in love with a stutterer, and dear reader, I married her. So, and several members of our shared family stutter, and I had the feeling of entering into a stuttering tribe. And so, paradoxically, at that moment, my speech became very fluent, which is how it goes. I still block sort of throughout the day, but I consider myself a non-stuttering stutterer these days. Having that distance from the experience of stuttering made me think very differently about it. I've spent a lot of my life involved in those questions of what causes stuttering and what cures stuttering, and not actually thinking often in a deeper sense around what stuttering means, or indeed what impact it might have on that thing I love most, which is the arts. And so this talk I'm about to begin starts to explain what I mean by that. It's about 20 minutes long, just under 20 minutes, so if any of you want to sit down, do. It starts quite light and gets more highbrow as it goes along, which is a familiar trick, so I can take any questions at the end, but I'm going to begin now. I'm going to start with a story. One summer's day in 1859, a 26-year-old mathematician called Charles Dodgson left his rooms at Christ Church in Oxford to catch the train to Hastings on the south coast of England. He was on his way to spend several weeks at Orr House, where James Hunt, another brilliantly clever 26-year-old, had set up a summer residency for stutterers. This was history in the making. At the time, most cures for stuttering still involved the scalpel over enthusiastic surgeons cutting off bits of the tongue. But Hunt was not a surgeon. The world didn't have a name for him yet, but he was what we today call a speech therapist, and the experimental residency he had established at Orr House was one of the earliest examples of intensive group therapy. We know a little about James Hunt's practice from the book he published the following year, Stammering and Stuttering, which he dedicated not to his patients, because he claimed to have none, but to his pupils. Hunt didn't believe there was a single cause of stuttering, nor a cure. He believed each sufferer was unique, and it was only by trying to understand them and helping them to understand themselves that the symptoms might be alleviated. His book is full of medical history, but it is also rich with literature and poetry, quoting generously from the Bible, Aristotle, and Shakespeare. Citing the philosopher John Locke, Hunt encouraged his pupils not to see themselves as flawed, but language itself as flawed. He told them to scrutinize language, to, quote, speak consciously as other men speak unconsciously. And under his tutelage, his pupils, working, living, and talking together, began to ask questions that had never been asked before. 3 of Hunt's pupils were or would become famous writers. All of them ultimately settled on a literary form that was intrinsically irreverent and linguistically playful, the Victorian fairy tale, or what would become fantasy literature. Charles Kingsley wrote The Water Babies, which includes such characters as Mrs. Do As You Would Be Done By and Mrs. Be Done By As You Did. George MacDonald wrote a string of books like The Princess and the Goblin, which all take place in fairyland, where you can encounter Prince Harelip or visit Gwynty Storm. But it's Charles Dodgson we're most interested in. Shortly after his stay at Orr House, the words began to pour out of him. There was the letter writing, not just the amount, and he wrote over 100,000 letters in his lifetime, but the form, puzzle letters that turn words upside down or into shapes or have to be read in a mirror. And then there was the unique relationship he had with Alice Liddell, the daughter of the Dean of Christ Church. We used to go to his rooms, she recalled in later life, escorted by our nurse. We used to sit on the big sofa on each side of him while he told us stories, illustrating them by pencil or ink drawings as he went along. In this way, the stories, slowly enunciated in his quiet voice with its curious stutter, were perfected. One afternoon in 1862, on a boating trip with a friend and the Liddell children, Charles began to make up an unusual tale. I sent my heroine straight down a rabbit hole to begin with, he wrote later, without the least idea what was to happen afterwards. The friend was astonished by what he was hearing. Dodgson, is this an extempore romance of yours? Yes, Charles replied, I'm making it up as we go along. And in case you haven't guessed it yet, the result was Alice in Wonderland, the most translated book after the Bible and the works of Shakespeare, which he published under his pen name Lewis Carroll. Now, Alice is a book built upon linguistic irreverence, perhaps the only one I know where the very plot is determined by the unreliability of words. Take, for instance, that first arrival in Wonderland when Alice cries so much at being lost, she almost drowns herself in the gathering of animals in her own tears. Having pulled themselves onto land, the question arises of how to get dry, which prompts a very dry lecture by a mouse on William the Conqueror. This same mouse then announces it will tell a long and sad tale, which transpires to be a concrete poem in the shape of its own tail. This is less a story than a series of very bad puns. Throughout the Alice books, the unexpected meaning of words provide a recurrent narrative impulse, sending the story hurtling off in unexpected directions or grinding temporarily to a halt, as when Alice's attempt at a logical discussion with the red and white queen in Looking Glass Land is rendered impossible because of their incessant and infuriating wordplay. Now, biographers rarely pay much attention to Charles's residency at Orr House in 1859, nor the fact he continued to consult James Hunt for the next 10 years. But anyone who stutters knows that an impediment resulting in this amount of attention to make the arduous journey across the country, to give up weeks of your time, signifies a condition that occupied no small part of Dodgson's waking hours. James Hunt taught his pupils to stop fearing language, but question it, doubt it, play with it, and make it their own. There are, of course, many conditions and influences required to create a great work of art. But without Dodgson's stutter, without James Hunt, I believe there would be no Alice. That's the end of the first bit of the story. Am I speaking loud enough?
Yes.
Is it slow enough? Are you following? Okay. We're now going to move forwards 150 years to the present. The last few years have seen the welcome rise of an identity politics around stuttering. When I was growing up, the aim of speech therapy was singular. They wanted to cure my stutter. I say they because I was too young to care when it started, although I soon came to crave a cure more than anything else in the world. Now the emphasis has shifted. The word cure is discouraged, partly because we believe a permanent cure is impossible, but also because we want each individual to find a level of stuttering that is right for them, rather than rid themselves of it entirely. It's about providing stutterers with a set of tools that can enable them to be more fluent when they need to, but also allows them to be themselves. In the UK, we have seen the emergence of self-organised stuttering groups in the workplace. There is the Civil Service Group, for instance, and the Defence and Armed Forces Group. There are similar as well as more radical groups here in the United States. Stutterers are starting to organise, to call out discrimination, in some cases to proclaim pride in their condition. As someone who works in the arts, I believe it is long overdue that we look at what it means to stutter in the creative sphere, because what I refuse to accept is that stutterers are just people who can't get words out. As the identity politics of stuttering grows, we need to define what it means to stutter in productive and creative terms rather than just negative ones. The neurologist and writer Oliver Sacks argued Tourette's syndrome was a condition which, when treated and rechanneled, can lead to staggering amounts of creativity and artistic output. Well, I think we can do the same for stuttering. The term poetics was used by Aristotle to describe his study of poetry and drama, and since then it has been applied to modernist poetry, Caribbean patois, classical music, cinema, and even abstract concepts like space. So I want us to consider what a poetics of stuttering might be. For a start, I believe stutterers are predisposed to develop into highly creative individuals, which is why that roll call of famous writers, actors, musicians, and philosophers who stutter is so high. This creativity isn't a generic condition shared by other artists, but has tendencies unique to those who stutter. Dr. Clare Butler, a senior lecturer at Newcastle University in England, has been doing research into stuttering in the workplace. In a recent interview on the BBC, she talked about how stutterers, quote, draw on a different sense of space. They use their own space in their heads to have 2 or 3 conversations ongoing at the same time. They will use different words dependent on which word they can say, end quote. Now, we all know that stutterers regularly substitute words, but the idea that through doing they develop a unique mental spatiality is intriguing. This suggests not just a different way of speaking, but a different way of thinking too. David Mitchell, the author of Cloud Atlas and other novels, puts it this way: your stammer informs your relationship with language and enriches it, if only because you need more structures and vocabulary at your command. He continues, quite probably if I could have produced unbroken, effortless sentences like my secretly envied classmates, I would never have felt the need to write them down, nor become a writer. So it is more than likely that the stuttering kid in the classroom who can't get their words out, who is laughed at and called an idiot, has paradoxically a superior linguistic versatility than any of those laughing at them. Unfortunately, that creative productivity tends to stay in their own heads unless they create an outlet for it. It can hardly be a surprise that stutterers who develop into writers are often terrifyingly prolific. Those words which they struggle to say aloud often pour out onto the page. Take Somerset Maugham, author of The Razor's Edge, who described his work as greatly influenced by his pronounced stutter. He wrote over 30 books of fiction, over 30 plays, and countless stories and volumes of essays and memoirs. Or take the over 100,000 letters that Charles Dodgson wrote in his lifetime. In both cases, this isn't creative writing so much as graphomania, the obsessive impulse to write. But more important than linguistic gymnastics and prolific productivity is the temperament of the stutterer. Anyone who stutters, whether the condition is mild or pronounced, develops a relationship with language fundamentally different to the fluent. The stutterer learns to distrust language to the same degree that the fluent come to unquestioningly believe in it. These are two very different ways of looking at the same tool. The Zimbabwean writer Dambudzo Marachera was bullied for his stutter as a child. "I was learning to distrust language," he later wrote, "a distrust necessary for a writer." I believe Marachera's distrust of language was similar to that taught by James Hunt to Charles Dodgson, but while Dodgson's distrust resulted in the playful Alice books, Marachera's simply added to the anger he felt as a black writer growing up in white-ruled Rhodesia. Both his stutter and his experiences of colonialism, he said, were, quote, "in the undergrowth of my experimental use of English, standing it on its head, brutalizing it into a more malleable shape for my own purposes. This may mean discarding grammar, throwing syntax out, subverting images, beating the drum and cymbals of rhythm, developing torture chambers of irony and sarcasm," end quote. Marachera died young, but his masterpiece, The House of Hunger, perfectly embodies the aesthetic he describes, full of anger, unusual sentence structure, and non sequiturs, and scenes that never end, but simply cut to one another mid-sentence, throwing us forwards or backwards in time. What Marachera opens up for us is the idea that as well as writing a lot and being versatile with words, the stutterer may even have a tendency towards experimental literary form. This is certainly true in the case of Lewis Carroll, and it is so in the work of contemporary American writer David Shields. In 1988, Shields published Dead Languages, a wonderful coming-of-age novel and one of the very best accounts of stuttering. Since then, he has developed his own experimental style of writing that is impossible to categorize. His books are fragmented, non-linear, with a hybridity of form and style. They are designed to expose the limits of language, to illustrate what he calls, quote, "my favorite idea, language is all we have to connect us, and it doesn't, not quite," end quote. Shields believes there is a philosophical tendency with stutterers to believe their impediment is faithful to human tension and consonant with the chaos of the world's content. It's that now familiar distrust again. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein stuttered throughout his life. He dedicated his life's work to showing again and again the limitations of language. Philosophy, he said, must begin with distrust of grammar. Yet he also believed language was ultimately inadequate for the task of philosophy. The best one could do was use it to show the failings of all previous philosophical thought. "I never more than half succeed in expressing what I want to express," he writes. "Often my writing is nothing but a form of stuttering." Wittgenstein's final book, The Philosophical Investigations, occupied the last 3 decades of his life, but remained unpublished at the time of his death. It is an extreme expression of the non-linearity that is found to varying degrees in the work of Lewis Carroll, Dambudzo Marachera, and David Shields. The Investigations is a series of remarks written on separate pieces of paper that Wittgenstein rearranged obsessively, although never settling on a correct order. To this day, there is no uncontested arrangement of the book. If stutterers learn to distrust language, one of the first things they call into question is its flow, the way words come together in set phrases and cliches that we rarely even think about anymore. For this reason, I don't think it is too much to say that in the same way the stutterer is denied verbal flow, he or she seeks to make a virtue of breaks, ruptures, and non-linearity in art. And that as well as a tendency towards linguistic dexterity and prolific output, there is also a tendency to experimentation in form, an experimentation that challenges the conventional flow of both sentences as well as stories and books themselves. Perhaps the best description of this is by Charles Dodgson in a rare account of his writing process. I jotted down at odd moments all sorts of odd ideas and fragments of dialogue that occurred to me, who knows how, apropos of nothing, specimens of that hopelessly illogical phenomenon, an effect without a cause. It is often said that language is humanity's greatest tool, and it is. But it is also hardwired to ossify into established phrases, patterns, and structures that can prevent real thinking. It's like a runaway train. For most people, resisting this is difficult because of habit and the self-generative nature of those patterns. It is made doubly hard because human societies determine inclusion on the basis of conformity to speech patterns, hence the appalling bullying that all stutterers experience in their childhood, and sometimes much later too. The ability to distrust language, and not just as a theoretical idea, but with the emotional intensity with which stutterers come to distrust it, is a powerful one. It can result in startling originality of expression, outlook, and creation. The more stutterers recognize this, the more we articulate the achievements of other stutterers, whether dead or alive, the more we can harness the very real productive power that stuttering brings. This may never be enough to counter the negative experience of stuttering, particularly in intense cases, but it is a start, and who knows where it will lead us. Thank you.
Thought-provoking, such research has gone into it. That was absolutely marvellous. Jonty asked earlier whether you might have questions or comments or thoughts, and if there are such things at the moment, or we'll continue with Jonty coming around to talk to you. If there's anything that somebody would like to say right now.
Thanks.
First of all, it was wonderful to hear you speak, and so there's such rich history there. So I'm hoping that will be in your book so that we can share that with others. So that's part of what your book is, kind of a synopsis of your book.
Yes, so it's early days, but this is where my thinking is, and those stories, I want to grow out those stories. So I want to write a lot about Lewis Carroll and that relationship with James Hunt, that not much has really been done around it. And so yes, I'll be writing about these things, and essentially what I want is that from the experience of reading the book, you get a sense of the very positive, productive and creative qualities that can come with stuttering, as well as all of the issues and struggles that many of us have with it as well.
Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you.